The night was quiet, the kind of silence that carries both peace and danger. A small neighborhood, filled with aging homes and even older stories, was about to witness something it would never forget. At the center of it all stood an elderly black man, a father, a neighbor, a figure respected by everyone who knew him. But respect doesn't always shield people from cruelty. Sometimes prejudice is stronger than reason, and that night it would lead to tragedy. Welcome back to Talecraft. If you're visiting us for the first time, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because here we bring you stories that shake the ground beneath our feet and leave us asking the hard questions. Today's story is one of heartbreak, injustice, and an ending so shocking it forces you to rethink everything you thought you knew about strength and survival. So let me ask you this: what would you do if the people you trusted to protect your family were the very ones who destroyed it? It began as an ordinary evening. The elderly man, frail but proud, walked home after helping a neighbor fix a broken fence. He was no stranger to struggle. Life had tested him in every possible way, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. Yet, as he turned onto his own street, flashing red and blue lights lit up the night. The arrival of 2 police cars wasn't unusual in that part of town, but the officers who stepped out carried something more than authority. They carried arrogance and hate. The encounter should have been nothing more than a brief conversation, a misunderstanding cleared up with calm words. Instead, it spiraled into an act of aggression fueled by prejudice. Shouts replaced reason, force replaced dialogue, and within minutes the unthinkable happened. That man, who had lived a long life filled with wisdom and resilience, was taken down in the most brutal way, by those sworn to protect him. His last breaths echoed into the night, heavy with injustice. But what those officers didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that help was already on the way. The man's son, an elite warrior, a legend in Delta Force, was closer than anyone realized. And when he arrived, the world would change for those officers in a way they never expected. The street was dimly lit, the glow of a flickering lamp casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The elderly man, let's call him Mr. Harris, had lived on that street for nearly 40 years. Neighbors knew him as the man who always greeted people with a nod, who carried groceries for others, and who never raised his voice. But that night the air was different. Tension moved like a storm cloud as the patrol cars screeched to a halt, doors flying open, and 2 officers stepping out with the swagger of men who believed the world belonged to them. "Sir, stop right there," one barked, though Mr. Harris hadn't even moved. His hands, weathered and slow, clutched the small paper bag he carried from the store, bread, milk, and a box of tea. He tried to explain, his voice calm, but the officers weren't listening. To them, he wasn't an elderly man coming home after helping a neighbor. To them, he was a target. The officers closed in. One yanked the bag from his hands, spilling its contents onto the street. The loaf of bread slid into the gutter, soaking up dirt. The milk bottle cracked against the pavement. Still, Mr. Harris remained calm. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I'm just going home." But those words fell into a void where compassion didn't exist. What came back instead were accusations, suspicion, demands. They accused him of loitering, of trespassing on his own block, twisting the situation into a narrative only they could control. When Mr. Harris reached slowly for his wallet, trying to show identification, one officer lunged. A shove to the chest sent him stumbling backward. Gasps came from the porches of neighbors who had gathered, but none dared step forward. They knew how quickly confrontation could turn deadly. Mr. Harris steadied himself, hands raised in surrender, but the officers saw only defiance. One grabbed his arm with such force that his frail body jerked forward. The other officer shouted, "Stop resisting," even though everyone could see, he wasn't resisting at all. What followed was a flurry of violence. A baton swung. A body collapsed. The sound of bones breaking pierced the night, followed by cries of disbelief from the witnesses. Mr. Harris hit the ground, breathless, his fragile body unable to withstand the brutal assault. He tried to speak, tried to tell them he was hurting, but his voice cracked into silence. Within moments, the man who had once been the quiet heart of that neighborhood lay motionless, his final moments stolen by hatred dressed in uniform. The silence afterward was unbearable. Neighbors stood frozen, hands trembling, some clutching their phones but too afraid to record openly. The officers, breathing heavily, looked down at the body as though it were nothing more than another statistic. One muttered, "Shouldn't have resisted," though everyone had seen the truth. The cruelty of that lie hung heavy in the air, poisoning the night even further. But fate was already shifting. Just down the road, headlights cut through the darkness. A vehicle approached, silent but steady, carrying a man who was no stranger to violence, but who had dedicated his life to protecting others from it. This man was Daniel Harris, Mr. Harris's son. To the world, he was a decorated Delta Force operative, a soldier who had spent years on missions no one could talk about. To his father, he was simply Danny, the boy who grew up on that very street, who promised long ago he would always protect his family. He hadn't expected that promise to be tested tonight. As he turned onto the block and saw the cluster of police cars, the scattered groceries, and the unmoving body on the ground, something inside him broke. Neighbors would later swear they saw his face shift from disbelief to rage in a single heartbeat. They would remember the way he slammed his car door and marched toward the scene with a presence so commanding that even the officers faltered. The tragedy had already unfolded, but what came next would become the moment everyone in that neighborhood, and soon the world, would talk about for years to come. Daniel Harris stepped onto the street, his boots crunching against the gravel, each sound a warning that reverberated in the tense night air. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the shattered groceries, the twisted body of his father, and the two officers frozen in mid-motion. For a moment, time seemed to slow, as though the world itself recognized the storm that had arrived. The neighbors held their breath, unsure if Daniel was here to reason, or to bring a reckoning that would change everything. The officers straightened, trying to mask the unease creeping into their expressions. One whispered to the other, barely audible, "It's him, the son." But words were useless against the presence of a man who had spent years mastering the art of precision, patience, and controlled fury. Daniel's reputation wasn't whispered in fear for nothing. It preceded him like a shadow stretching over the horizon. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. The moment itself carried the weight of warning. "Sir, we can explain," one officer stammered, taking a step backward. But Daniel's gaze didn't waver. His eyes, sharp and calculating, measured every movement, every twitch, every lie he could sense before it was spoken. He saw fear now, the kind that comes only when someone realizes that the world they thought was theirs has suddenly shifted. A life lived in arrogance and impunity was about to be measured against a force neither officer could anticipate. Daniel knelt beside his father, quickly checking for signs of life, even though deep down he already knew. The veteran Delta Force operative moved with efficiency born from years of battlefield experience. Hands precise, posture controlled, mind racing. Despite the chaos, despite the terror, he remained calm. But his calm was dangerous. It was a calm that whispered to everyone watching that someone had finally come who would settle the score. The taller officer stepped forward, raising his hands in what he hoped was a neutral gesture. "We were just," he began. Daniel didn't allow the sentence to finish. He rose slowly, his voice low but steady. "You took him from me," he said, every syllable heavy with the weight of loss, every pause loaded with threat. The words didn't need to be loud. They reverberated in the night, commanding attention, demanding acknowledgement. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as Daniel surveyed the scene, his body tense but controlled, a living testament to years of training, discipline, and survival. This wasn't rage without reason. It was measured, lethal potential restrained by principle. The officers, once confident, now understood the gravity of their misjudgment. They had faced authority before, but they had never faced a force tempered by battlefield experience and boundless determination to protect family. Then, almost imperceptibly, Daniel's stance shifted. Every muscle coiled, every eye locked on the officers. He spoke again, calm yet icy, "You made a mistake you cannot undo." In those few words, the promise of accountability was unmistakable. The officers exchanged glances, fear now undeniable. They were no longer in control. Their uniforms, their badges, they offered no protection against the presence of a man who had seen war, who had led soldiers in impossible missions, and who had now returned home to defend what mattered most. Neighbors later described the scene as surreal. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't charge recklessly. He simply existed, and his presence alone commanded compliance. One officer dropped his gaze, the other's hands began to shake. Every instinct honed over years of abuse of power screamed at them that they were outmatched. The world outside their training, outside their authority, had intruded, and it would not forgive. The air was thick with tension. Daniel's voice finally broke the silence again. "Step back or you will regret it." It was a single command, precise, unyielding, and yet controlled. One officer froze. The other stammered and then slowly, hesitantly took a step backward. Daniel didn't pursue. He didn't need to. The point had been made. Power had been recalibrated in that moment, and everyone who witnessed it knew that the consequences of the night's earlier actions would be felt long after. It was in that moment, standing over his father, the Delta Force operative revealed not only his strength but the lesson that had been ignored. Courage, discipline, and love for family can outweigh arrogance, privilege, and blind hatred. The officers had underestimated a son, a soldier, and a man, and that mistake would define the remainder of their lives. Daniel Harris remained motionless for a moment, surveying the officers who had underestimated him and his family. His father lay unmoving yet alive, and every second mattered. He could feel the tension in the air, the fear radiating from the men who had caused irreparable damage. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, now seemed fragile, hollow, incapable of protecting them from accountability. "Step away from the scene," Daniel commanded, voice low, precise, and unwavering. The officers obeyed, slowly retreating, their eyes wide, realizing that the street was no longer theirs. Daniel's presence alone had shifted the balance of power. Every neighbor watching felt the palpable change, understanding that justice was no longer abstract. It was standing right there, controlled by the hands of a man trained to confront chaos and enforce order when it mattered most. He knelt beside his father again, checking the injuries with professional precision. Every motion was calculated, every touch deliberate, born from years of combat and medical survival training. He stabilized his father as best as possible before speaking to the officers. "You don't understand the consequences of your actions," he said, his tone calm but lethal in its authority. "Every choice you made tonight has a cost." The taller officer swallowed hard. We didn't mean," he started, but Daniel cut him off with a single, piercing glance. The words didn't need to be loud. The message was clear. Excuses would not erase what had been done. Accountability was coming, immediate and unavoidable. The officer's bravado, once a shield, had evaporated under the weight of reality. Daniel's mind raced, considering every angle. The local authorities could be called, evidence preserved, and yet he knew that justice often moved slower than needed. But tonight, the threat of force combined with undeniable moral authority could prevent further tragedy. He made it clear, cooperation was the only path forward. The officers were no longer in control, they were guests in a storm they had provoked. Neighbors watched, some trembling, others filming discreetly, capturing every moment of this confrontation. Daniel finally addressed them, his voice softer but carrying the weight of command. "Call the authorities. Report everything you saw. Do not let fear keep you silent." His words were a bridge between the violence that had just occurred and the systemic justice he intended to ensure. It was a lesson, a warning, and a declaration all at once. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Backup arrived, not to support the offending officers, but to document, intervene, and ensure the situation did not escalate further. Daniel remained vigilant, every muscle ready, every instinct sharp. He didn't need to strike. His presence, his reputation, and the undeniable evidence of his father's injuries sufficed to establish authority. The officers were now under scrutiny, their previous power evaporated in the face of truth. One of the officers finally spoke, his voice shaking. We understand. We'll comply." Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging that this was the first step toward accountability. But he didn't lower his guard. Justice, he knew, required vigilance until the system had formally acted. Every gesture, every word, was meant to ensure that no further harm would come to his family or the witnesses who had seen the night's events unfold. He looked down at his father, whose breathing was labored but steady. "You're going to be okay," Daniel murmured, his voice softer now but firm. Then he turned back to the officers. "Let this be a lesson. You answer for your actions now and there will be consequences. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now." The finality in his tone left no room for misunderstanding. The officers nodded, fully aware that the path ahead was narrow and unforgiving. Daniel's control of the situation ensured that law enforcement oversight would follow, and no further abuse could occur under the cover of authority. The Delta Force operative had not just arrived too late. He had arrived with precision, ensuring that justice, accountability, and consequence were immediate. As the officers were escorted away by arriving authorities, neighbors whispered among themselves, the fear slowly giving way to awe. They had witnessed a rare event, courage and discipline confronting injustice directly, unflinchingly, and with the certainty of victory. For Daniel Harris, the night was far from over, but the balance of justice had been recalibrated, the night had settled, leaving the street quiet, the chaos of earlier hours giving way to a fragile calm. Daniel Harris stood beside his father, watching as medical personnel ensured his injuries were properly treated. Though the adrenaline was fading, the intensity of the confrontation remained imprinted on everyone who had witnessed it. The lesson had been delivered. No act of violence against the innocent went unanswered. Neighbors began to speak quietly among themselves, some in awe, others in relief. They had witnessed more than just a violent incident. They had seen courage, discipline, and family loyalty confront corruption and abuse directly. The officers, once symbols of unchecked authority, had been humbled. Justice had arrived in a form that was immediate, tangible, and undeniably firm. The community felt a shift in the balance, a reminder that accountability,